Ladies and gentlemen, losers and clowns, welcome one and all to iWizard. Today, we're going to be talking about the horror novel, It, and what I, a longtime Stephen King skeptic, thought of this book. Let's get to it. We lie best when we lie to ourselves. Sometimes home is where the heart is. I believe that. Old Bobby Frost said home's the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. Unfortunately, it's also the place where, once you're in there, they don't ever want to let you out. Home again forever, he had thought then. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe this isn't home, nor ever was. Maybe home is where I have to go tonight. Home is the place where when you go there, you finally face the thing in the dark. Eddie discovered one of his childhood's great truths. Grown-ups are the real monsters. It occurred to him that kids were better at incorporating the inexplicable into their lives. They believed implicitly in the invisible world. Miracles, both bright and dark, were to be taken into consideration. When you grew up, all that changed. You no longer lay awake in your bed, sure something was crouching in the closet or scratching at the window. But when something did happen, something beyond rational explanation, the circuits overloaded. You started to jitter and jive. You either went crazy or got to a place where it was impossible for you to function. They all float down here. When you're down here with us, you'll float too. All right, Jordan here. So a couple of things before we get into what I thought of the book. First, a little bit of context. This book was published in 1986. It's Stephen King's 22nd novel, and I believe it is the 17th that he published under his own name. As a writer myself, I still am amazed that this guy can write so fast. He still writes very fast. This book is probably somewhere in the top 3 or 4 most popular Stephen King novels ever written. For some people, it's number 1. For most, it's probably number 2 after The Stand, from what I hear, though a lot of diehard Stephen King fans say that his earlier work, like Salem's Lot or The Dead Zone or Pet Sematary or The Shining, that stuff is his best work. I suppose you guys could debate about that in the comments. So let's talk about the story here in Stephen King's It. I've got a little summary that I've put together here for you, and so here it goes. The drain. Things down there in the drain. Things down there in the drain that might reach up and get you. The awful necessity of having to go down the drain to face those things. It tells the story of a group of 7 friends who must face an ancient, evil, shape-shifting entity that emerges from the sewer every 27 years to prey on the town's children, feeding on their deepest fears. Its favorite disguise is a circus clown called Pennywise, otherwise known as Bob Gray. The book alternates between their childhood in the 1950s and 27 years later in the mid-80s. Banding together over the course of one horrifying summer, Richie Tozier, Beverly Marsh, Ben Hanscom, Eddie Kaspbrak, and Mike Hanlon, otherwise known as the Losers Club, must overcome their own personal fears to battle the murderous, bloodthirsty clown known as Pennywise. The story is a mashup of King's favorite themes. It's about the power of memory, childhood trauma, and the way it has a tendency of following you around for the rest of your life, the malevolence lurking beneath the idyllic facade of the American small town, and overcoming evil through mutual friendship, courage, and sacrifice. All right, let's talk a little bit of backstory here with me and Stephen King. If you watched my fall TBR video, you know I came into this review with a lot of excitement and also some trepidation. I have a bit of a complicated relationship with Stephen King. I've been a King skeptic for a long time. I had always been told that Stephen King was this kind of lowbrow author, that he had these literary pretensions, but that at bottom he was basically just kind of a mass market horror writer. So in a way, people would tell me it's the worst of both worlds, right? His writing is both schlocky, but it's dressed up with this thin literary veneer. It's vapid beach reading, but it pretends to be more. One friend actually told me that Stephen King writes like a talented MFA student who's always trying too hard to impress the class. And I thought that was funny. And I always wondered if it was true. And so I never really picked Stephen King up because of everything I'd heard. I think I'd read a short story or two of his, and they weren't bad, but that was really all I had ever read of Stephen King. And then when I was in grad school, I read King's memoir, On Writing. And to my surprise, I loved it. On Writing is one of the best books I've ever read on the subject of writing well, writing fiction in particular, the writer's life. And so I said, wow, this guy can actually write. Maybe I was wrong about him. So a couple of years went by, and eventually I came to teach this AP course for seniors, and I decided to make my students read On Writing. And they loved it too. So I said, okay, why don't I try reading one of King's fiction books? If I liked his memoir, maybe I'll like his fiction. So I went to the library and I picked up Under the Dome, which if you haven't come across it, it is this massive hulking book. The cover makes it look like kind of sci-fi in a small town. So I said, okay, I'm going to give this one a try. It looks like something I'd really enjoy. So I read Under the Dome, and I initially liked it for probably the first 150 pages. And then it started getting really ridiculous. Some of the things that were happening in this town were just too much for me. I couldn't suspend my disbelief. The characters I felt were these stock bad guys, these caricatures, and it just felt kind of juvenile to me. Reading Under the Dome, it just kind of felt like it was confirming some of the things that people had told me about King's writing. I got halfway through this thing and I DNF'd it. It just wasn't for me. So I stepped away from King for a time, and I found that whenever I shared my experience with friends over the years, they pretty much said the same thing, that I had made a mistake picking Under the Dome. They said that if you're going to pick a Stephen King book to read first, it shouldn't be Under the Dome. It's really not his best work. The ending is ridiculous. The characters are lazy. It's just not one of King's better books. You should read It, or Pet Sematary, or Salem's Lot, or something like that, or The Stand. So I'm like, all right, I'll give him one more try, and I did. And this time I decided to read It, okay? And this was probably 3 years ago, and I'll say it was a lot better than Under the Dome, and there were parts of it that I quite enjoyed at the time. But again, I just, for some reason, could not get into it. It could have been the headspace that I was in. Maybe it's because I wasn't used to reading books with that many characters, or books that jump back and forth to two different decades, 27 years apart. That could have been it. So I just put it down. I had some family stuff going on, and I DNF'd another King book. And to this day, I've always kind of felt bad about it. I don't like to DNF books. And now here we are. And I said, okay, with this new BookTube channel that I'm doing, I think it's time to give Stephen King one last try. I have some colleagues who swear by Stephen King. They say, you just got to give him another chance. So I said, okay, I'm going to take a week and I'm going to read It one last time. You may be wondering why it's been a full week since I've produced a video. It's because this is like a 1,200 page book, maybe more. So I said, I'm going to go into it this time with a positive attitude. I'm going to try to be fair about it. I've always wanted to like this book. I've always wanted to like Stephen King. This book's about coming of age and childhood in Maine and suburbia. It takes place in the 50s and 80s. It just seemed like my kind of thing. So I did. I gave it another shot, and here we are. And I'm going to tell you, overall, I liked the book quite a bit. Maybe I'm in a better headspace now. Maybe it's because I've read so much complex fantasy literature that's told from multiple perspectives in between then and now. But I'm glad I read this. It did mostly work for me. And there were a number of things that I found highly compelling about this book. There were some truly frustrating things as well, and we're going to get into that. But before I get into what I liked and what I didn't like, I want to mention something. It's funny. We see King's It now as this cultural touchstone, right? This really important horror novel, this pop cultural phenomenon that's adored by pretty much everyone. They keep making movies. And yet when this book came out in 1986, it didn't receive the glowing adulation that it now receives, right? In fact, readers didn't think the book was particularly scary or interesting. If you search online and read reviews from the 80s, you hear lines like, the book tries too hard, it reaches for too much. One New York Times review said, there's just too much of it, pun intended. It's too damned complicated. That's what it says in the New York Times review. So I find it interesting that when this book came out, it was not the same smash hit that we imagine that it was today. Why is that, right? Why was it kind of unpopular in the 80s and why is it popular today? Well, here's my theory. I think today we largely read this book with a kind of loving nostalgia. Even as a King skeptic, I found myself enjoying large portions of this book, and I think I know at least one of the reasons why. For people like me, and I'm, by the way, an older millennial, but also for Gen Xers, I think it offers both 1980s and 1950s nostalgia. See, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and so I found the kind of 80s nostalgia stuff in this book to be really compelling and exciting. My parents, on the other hand, grew up in the 50s and 60s, so I was also raised with the family values and the slogans and the old world sentiments of the 1950s. I'd be stuck in the car with my parents, and I'd have to listen to their stories and their doo-wop music, their 1950s music, and stuff like that. We watched 50s movies. And then, of course, I actually lived through the 80s and the 90s. So I think one of the reasons that it worked so well for me is because it hit on that nostalgia that I feel. So the book may lack a tight plot. It may lack a certain sharpness or coherence. It may at times lack direction. And you could see how this would have mattered when it was published in 1986, but today we do see it differently because this book is filled with the sayings and attitudes and rock and roll songs and memorabilia and TV references of the 80s and also the 50s. And so we read it now as kind of a nostalgia piece. And I do think that that's why it's so popular in this moment. People are obsessed with 80s movies and styles and graphics and video games and art at the current moment. And the same goes with the 1950s. America has been obsessed with the 1950s, well, ever since the 1950s, right? Think about Grease and 50s diners and rockabilly and all the movies and TV shows that have come out, both glorifying and offering kind of lingering criticism on the 1950s. Think about movies like The Sandlot and Blast from the Past and Pleasantville and even shows like WandaVision, right? So we just keep making movies about the 50s. We're continually fascinated, especially on the internet, with the 1980s. And so we're just fascinated with these eras. And I think this book sparks that nostalgia in us today in a way that it didn't in the 1980s. Even younger kids, Gen Zers, kids who watch Stranger Things, which incidentally, Stranger Things was inspired by Stephen King's It. Even younger generations are kind of captivated by the 80s suburbia, retro horror movies. So I would say that if you're someone who likes Stranger Things and John Carpenter's Halloween, you're going to love this book, if for nothing other than the fact that it's got that sort of 50s and 80s aesthetic vibe. Halloween in the 50s, Halloween in the 80s. That's what this book kind of feels like. All right, so let's get into it a bit more by talking about what I liked and what I didn't like, okay? So what I liked. Why don't we start from the beginning of the book? I loved the intro, chapter 1. It definitely had the feel of suburban legend, right? You knew what was coming, but you didn't know when or exactly how. I love how the book is structured and the way that King tells each story from a bunch of different angles. For example, instead of just telling us what happened in some police interrogation, he'll just show the scene from the perspective of one of the cops, and then from the perspective of the suspect or multiple suspects, from the perspective of their parents or the bar owner. One thing that King does particularly well is that you'll find out something happens, for example, that Adrian Mellon was killed, and then King will give you the backstory from everyone who was involved in that murder, and you come to really learn a lot about the town of Derry that way. He uses all these different mechanisms to tell this story, right? He'll include officers' reports and news clippings, right? And letters and all of that. So you kind of feel like you're piecing together a puzzle. So I really liked the way that King would briefly tell us about some tragedy that took place, and then he would zoom out and build back up to it. So for example, when you meet Patricia Uris at the start of chapter 3, you immediately learn about this tragedy that befalls her, that her husband dies in a bathtub, and you're wondering what happened, how it happened, and then King stops and goes back, and then readers get the full backstory. So it's a great way to write horror because it sets you up with this sense of lingering dread, right? In literary studies, they call this dramatic irony, when you know something that one or more of the characters don't know. So King tells you that a tragedy befalls Patricia Uris, then he goes back to a time when she herself doesn't know that the tragedy is going to befall her, but the reader knows. So he's good at building tension and suspense that way by using dramatic irony. Speaking of chapter 3, I thought that this long stretch of the book was really impressive. The chapter, I believe, is called 6 Phone Calls, and it's structured around, well, 6 phone calls. And basically it's each of the adult members of the Losers Club picking up the phone to receive the exact same news, which is that they something has happened. They have to return to Derry because basically it is back, right? So they all have to get back together, fulfill this pact that they made, and this is really the call to adventure of the story. And this way you also get to get each of their backstories. So when you meet most of the Losers Club for the first time, you're meeting their adult selves rather than their child selves. So I thought that was really a unique and effective way to do it. Let's file this also under things that I liked. Stephen King is a good storyteller. The way that he uses figurative language and metaphor, King is the master of metaphor. He is the master of these tight, evocative little similes. As an author, he's also really good at writing childhood and coming of age. He knows how kids talk, or at least how they used to talk, right? I don't know if kids talk like that anymore. And that's, I would say, part of the reason why people my age and older tend to enjoy reading Stephen King. When I was a kid, I had one of those rambling Huck Finn, Stephen King sort of childhoods. It would be summer and I would just go out and play outside with my friends all day long. We'd build forts, we'd get in trouble, we'd build ramps for our bikes and our skateboards, we'd get into fights, and my mom had this loud whistle that you could hear all throughout the neighborhood. And the only rule was that I had to come home around dinner time when she let out that whistle and called for me. And so that's what it really feels like in this book with the Losers Club. And so King is really a master of writing about that kind of rollicking, freewheeling childhood that we used to have. If you grew up in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, even the 90s, you'll definitely know what I'm talking about, right? And so this was actually quite a nostalgic read for me. I don't think that kids are allowed to grow up that way anymore, which is kind of sad in my opinion. In fact, there's actually data to support this. They do these studies where they ask groups of people at different ages, how old were you when your parents first let you play outside completely unsupervised? And if you ask a group of folks from the Greatest Generation, they'll say, oh, I was like 6 years old. My parents would just let me play outside unsupervised, 6 or 7, and they'll ask a group of baby boomers, and the baby boomers, the average in that group will be something like 8 years old. Then you ask the Gen Xers, and the Gen Xers, the consensus will be 9 or 10. And when you get to the millennials and the Gen Zers, you begin to hear 11, 12, 13, 14, even 15. Some of them still in high school aren't allowed to go anywhere unsupervised. In fact, I read somewhere that Gen Z kids don't do drugs. They don't have sex as young, which that right there is probably a good thing. You'd be happy about that if you were a parent. But apparently these younger kids are now developing more slowly. They don't get their driver's licenses until they're like 21, which is crazy to me because I was obsessed with getting my license. In fact, I was driving around even before I had my license. So anyways, I don't know if everything in this book will resonate with Gen Zers, just because I feel like they haven't really had the same kind of childhood. Like the kids in this book build a fort. It's like a clubhouse that is basically just a hole in the ground, augmented with odds and ends from this local dump, right? Do kids even do that anymore? So it really reminded me of my childhood, and I enjoyed the nostalgia fest. Okay, what else? Overall, this is a very psychological book. So much of this book, probably the entire first half of it, probably 50% of the book as a whole, is very psychological. A lot of it is inner monologue or flashback that is occurring completely in the adult characters' heads as they're thinking about their childhoods and their mothers and their neuroses and their buried traumas and cognitive dissonances. Anyways, there's so much going on in this novel. So much of it is psychological. And because of that, I feel like there's really no way a TV miniseries or film could ever do this novel justice. When you watch a film version or a miniseries, they make it so much more about Pennywise the Clown, which the first half of this book really isn't about Pennywise at all, or at least it's much more about the characters and learning their backstories and learning who they are and the relationship that they had and still do have as adults and that sort of thing, examining their sort of inner psychological states. So I feel like this would be a really hard book to actually capture on the big screen. Another fun thing for me in this book was the meditation on libraries with Mike Hanlon and stuff like that. How and Ben Hanscom, how magical libraries are for people who love to read. How vital I guess they kind of are as a public good, right? How important they are. I know I got into reading at the library, and I know a lot of other people got into reading that way as well. So I guess I'll mention one or two more positive things I really like. This book deals with everything. The themes are really deep and expansive. King examines coming of age, puberty, sexuality. The book's really about the way in which we change but never really do, right? It's kind of that Herodotus idea, character is destiny. I believe that's Herodotus. Anyways, it's about innocence and experience. It's a story about a group of adults who are haunted by their childhoods, right? I think the book is prophetic in a lot of ways. It really captures, I think, something deep about modernity, about our condition in the modern age, the way that adults become calcified at a certain point in life, right? Stuck in the past, right? And so I think it's kind of apt that this book is a nostalgia fest because in many ways, the adult characters in this book are incapable of moving on as well. When the Losers Club finally gets together as adults, they all realize that none of them really have been able to move on. They haven't even been able to have kids. And that itself has something to do with what they all experienced as children. Their childhoods have prevented them from moving on. And in some ways, they're doomed to stay children until they go back to Derry and deal with their childhood. So there's something very Freudian about this story too. It's got probably also a Peter Pan kind of quality to it, right? What were some other things that I liked? I guess there were just some kind of cool little plot devices. I thought the house on Neibolt Street being a portal for it to be able to enter the overworld was kind of a clever device and that sort of thing. So there were a lot of things that I really liked in this book. All right, let's now get to what I did not like. And as always, guys, keep in mind that this is just one man's opinion here. I'm not trying to have the constant readers Stephen King fan club come after me on this one. Though, if you disagree with anything I say here, you're more than welcome to let me know in the comment section. I love constructive debate and disagreement. That would be awesome, actually. So if anything I say strikes you as interesting, or you like it, or you dislike it, feel free to put that in the comment section. And I probably won't even moderate it unless someone's being really nasty. All right, so things that I didn't like. So one thing I wondered about the entire time is this question, and I know this is a really nitpicky thing, but just this question of why have all the main adult characters in the book become so successful, wealthy, in some cases, famous success stories, right? It just doesn't seem realistic. So you have let's look at the Adult Losers Club here. You have a famous novelist who's married to a movie star. You have a famous architect. You have an amazingly successful up-and-coming fashion designer and owner of her own fashion company. You have a famous radio personality and comedian, right? You have a very successful, world-famous architect. Another guy is just a limo driver, but he's like an elite limo driver who drives people like Al Pacino around. In fact, he owns an entire limousine company and a big house on Long Island. There's really only one of them who is even remotely normal, and he's a librarian. He's the only one of the crew who actually stayed behind in Derry, but even he is like this gifted autodidact who publishes journal articles, and he's this eloquent chronicler of Derry who has this well-written, unpublished book that sits unread in the library. So now I understand that this is nitpicky, and I understand that King fans will tell me that this has something to do with what all of the characters went through, and so maybe that's why they're successful, because they're trying to prove something. But I'm just wondering, why aren't any of these characters like normal lower to lower middle class people? Why aren't any of them like grocery store clerks or mail carriers or like plumbers or whatever, right? So I know that King touches on this in chapter 10 of the book, but I feel like he never really fully explained it. I'm sure it's possible. This is a 1,200 page book, so I guess it's possible that my eyes glazed over in one of the sections where he explains it better. If so, definitely let me know in the comments. It just seemed kind of unrealistic and distracting to me that they were all these almost famous success stories, right? It just seemed kind of odd. Another thing I'll mention, and I think this is less nitpicky, is that in this book, King uses this, in my opinion, rather obnoxious, kind of out of control, omnipotent third person narrative POV. And I just really wasn't into that. One of the things that makes the human experience meaningful is that we are limited, subjective beings. We can't see into everyone's heads, and that is a good thing. And so I've found that I like third person limited better if you're going to do third person, because there's still some mystery and the characters feel more real. So I really didn't love the omniscient narration. So there was that. There's also a part in the middle stretch of the book that drags a lot. It really starts in the part where the kids each have their own frightening experience with Pennywise, the part where they're building the dam, the part where Henry Bowers is in prison, and even just the last half of the book is just really long-winded. It didn't feel like that in the beginning, but there are parts of this story that really drag. And I think part of the reason why is that so much of this book is really repetitive. King would have something happen to one of the characters when he was a kid. Then the adult version of that character would remember this thing that happened to him later on in his mind as an adult. And then the adult losers club would get together and they would discuss that same thing as a group. And then you'd go back in time and they'd remember it together again as children. And keep in mind, there are 6 or 7 main characters in this book, and it just felt like King was doing this all the time. Something would happen, and I'd go, yep, I got it. I know what happened. And then he would repeat it 6 or 7 times, and there were moments where I just wanted to tear my eyes out, right, reading this book. Another thing I'll mention that I have yet to read anything by Stephen King that this isn't true about, okay, is melodramatic characterization. Many of the characters are caricatures. Not so much the main ones, okay? So King is really good at writing characters. The main characters were mostly compelling and pretty well fleshed out, but many of the people that the main characters interact with are total caricatures, and this is just my opinion, right? If it's possible that many of you out there just totally disagree with that. I was telling my wife this. King doesn't write down to his readers per se, which is a good thing, but he does write down to his characters, right? He writes his characters down, literally, below him, and it's as if he's giggling about it with his readers, right? His characters feel as if he tried to make them or sees them as being much dumber than himself. It's heavy with straw man arguments and cartoonish bad guy personalities who just say the most cliche, platitudinous things. It almost reminds me of how King behaves on Twitter. If you follow his Twitter, you'll know what I'm talking about with the straw manning and the caricature and the platitudes. I'll just say it kind of feels like King sees himself as being superior to many of his characters, and you can really sense that in the writing, and it wasn't a good thing, okay? All right, so now for the one that everyone talks about, the gratuitous sexualization of children. Now look, as I've said before, I am a big free speech guy, so I'm not trying to chastise King or scold him like some school marm. Dude is allowed to write about anything he wants. You know, one of the things I like to remind people who are constantly offended by books is that, guys, this is a story. It's not real. And it's about real life, but it's not actually real. And so if it's going to be about real life, look, real life is scary. It's bloody. It's filled with bad people and evil. In real life, there are rapists and murderers and child molesters and racists and thugs and everything in between. So I'm never going to get on an author for trying to portray real life, how it actually is. In fact, I want to see that kind of courage in a writer. But when you can't do it well and it feels out of place, I'm going to mention that something feels off, right? So in it, you have this almost over-the-top amount of child sexualization. Things like the shape-shifting Pennywise creature in the form of a leper chasing children around, offering them blowjobs, and describing the blowjobs he's going to give to these little boys as he's chasing them. Boys masturbating each other in the woods. And then there was that Patrick Hockstetter kid. Ugh, just really, really nasty. And then, of course, there's the infamous scene, the notorious scene, where the kids just, like, decide that they need to have this orgy together in the sewers. in order to survive, right? It's like we need to have sex with each other, and King needs to show 11 and 12-year-old boys taking turns having raunchy sex with this 12-year-old girl, and he has to show it to us in excruciating detail. And I just felt so over the top, so gratuitous. I get that the moment is supposed to portray this sort of coming of age thing, and that they need to feel intimately connected as a group, and how it, right, the title of the book and the name of the monster needs to be conflated with the act of sex, and he's probably trying to do this whole Freudian thing with it. I just thought it was a little over the top. It was gratuitous, so much so that it felt out of place. And so that's all, right? I'm not trying to scold him. I'm just saying it wasn't tactfully done. I know human beings are sexual beings, but when it's children and it's happening so often, and it just feels so kind of crude and just sort of, it's oddly focused on the children's sexuality, and it's done so in a way that is not really tasteful. It was just odd, and it took me out of the narrative, and it felt out of place. Okay, so I'm sorry if I am depressing all of you constant readers out there, but I'm going to mention one more thing that I didn't like. Okay, so I know this is going to piss off some of you, but I feel I have to be honest. I felt like the conceit of the novel, in which there's this haunting, amorphous, shape-shifting monster who can come in any form and make anything happen at any time. It was just too much for me. It basically allows the author to just write these over-the-top horror scenes, very few of which are actually scary, and they're just kind of absurdist, sort of Salvatore Dali paintings. So in the story, the group will be sitting around a table eating fortune cookies, and suddenly there's this swelling eyeball inside of one of the fortune cookies. It's like, oh, look over there, there's a mummy, right? And over there, there's a werewolf, and over there, there's a vampire, and a giant spider, and it's real, but it's not real. It's in our heads, but it's actually real, and it's out there. Just the number of goofy evils lurking, the number of coincidences and evils that he's just constantly throwing at us all the time. And I know this is explained in the book. I know that this is all happening because the so-called it is a glamour that takes the form of whatever you're most afraid of. So it is appearing as one thing for one person and another thing for someone else. And I understand why all of this is happening. It just felt like it made it too easy for King to just pack every single trope from every single horror film or novel that I've ever read and throw it all into one book, and that sort of thing. And so anyways, my point is just, at times, this idea that King can make anything happen anywhere at any time without any sense of order. You're not really sure whether things are happening in the characters' heads. Are they happening in real life? There's just not enough order, not enough rules, right? It just felt like utter chaos for the entire second half of the book. It reminds me of that Robert Frost poem. Poetry without form and structure is like playing tennis without a net. I felt for the second half of the book as if Stephen King was playing tennis without a net, and it just felt wrong. The characters dream things, but then they wake up and some of it's real and some of it isn't real. They become each other, then they're themselves again, then they have these unexplained powers. Objects are melting, pictures are changing, it is coming to them through the radio. Everything's exploding all of the time. All of this is supposed to be happening in the real world, but there's this whole creation story about it and a turtle. It was just, a lot of it was over the top for me, okay? And you know, one of the things that I had been told about Stephen King's novels that made me kind of stay away from him for many years is that many of them end with everything blowing up, falling apart, descending into cataclysm, etc. I won't spoil the ending of it, but I will say only that my friends were not wrong about this as far as at least this book is concerned, about the way that King ends his books. All right, so now that I have fully alienated all those wonderful King fans and made them hate me and not want to tune into my channel, let's get into my rating of this book, okay? And you might be surprised. I give it a fairly good rating here. Okay, so let's start with story. The story in this book, the plot, earns only a 6 for me. Sad to say. As I said, this story kind of went off the rails for me, especially about 2/3 of the way through the book. It just kind of began to get weirder and weirder and less constrained. It's okay if a book gets weird and trippy, but it should still be constrained. I should be able to suspend disbelief and really get into it. And it felt like anything, really anything goes for the second half of this book. Characters, there were some really good characters in this book. I loved Beverly and Eddie Kaspbrak and his mother and even his Eddie Kaspbrak's wife. Truly amazing characters. I enjoyed Bill Denbrough too. As an adult, Bill Denbrough, who is Georgie's older brother, is now a horror novelist like King himself. Actually, from having read King's memoir, there are actually a lot of similarities between Bill Denbrough and King. I really loved the way King writes child characters, kids, childhood, that sort of thing. As I said, King really nails the way that kids talk to each other, especially the way that boys talk to each other, always ragging on each other, swearing, one-upping each other. That's just the way that boys talk. That's just the way that guys talk. The way that Bill, Eddie, Richie, and Ben become friends, the way that the Losers Club bonds and becomes friends, that felt really authentic, and that sort of thing. I really liked Beverly Marsh as a character. She's tough and stoic, but also smart. She's running away from an abusive relationship, so she really appreciates this reunion with the Losers Club in a way that the other members really don't. The story with Henry Bowers, a lot of that is really interesting as well. I would just say, you know, Stephen King can write about nothing and still make his characters entertaining. I love how he writes Richie Tozier's different voices in dialect, right? All of his accents and his little skits, his little characters. I love how King will... One of the things that King did in this book that I thought was really clever is that he would end a chapter with one of the adults having a memory. He'll cut the adult's memory off in mid-sentence. Then he'll start the next chapter by finishing the sentence in the past from the perspective of the person as a child. And he did that many times, and it was very effective. I liked how the city of Derry was like its own character in the story. So I thought... you know, King did a great job. I loved the relationships and how this horror that the Losers Club has experienced really brought them all together. How sort of the horror that they've gone through together sort of chooses them to be friends with one another. So the characters for me get a 9. King did a really good job with at least the main characters. Let's talk about the prose. I'll just say this. Stephen King is a good writer, and he knows it. So sometimes the prose is on fire. It's electric. I can imagine Stephen King writing a masterpiece, right? I think he has it in him. But sometimes the prose was tedious, boring, long-winded, overwrought, and that sort of thing, right? So the prose for me definitely is going to get an 8. Let's talk about originality. There's a lot of originality here mixed in with stuff that is way less original. At bottom, I felt like this book was a giant pastiche of horror tropes, allusions, references, a pastiche of other writers' styles. The whole thing felt at times like a long, drawn-out writing exercise. Although I will say King wasn't afraid to take risks, so I do appreciate that. Some experiments worked for me, some didn't. So that gets a 7.5 right there. Let's talk about the world building. This was a smash home run. The world building gets a full 10 here. The world building was incredible. No stone in Derry is left unturned. As I said, Derry, the city, winds up being almost like a character in this book. You learn about its past, you learn about its people, about its barons, its plumbing, its policing, its past labor strikes. You learn about the history of discrimination in the city and the history of violence. And you begin to recognize even street names. Like, I feel like when you're done reading this book, you probably could make your way around the city were you to actually go there. So the world building gets a full 10, smash bang home run on that. So overall, this book earns an 8.1 out of 10. Okay, see? That wasn't so bad, guys. Not bad for a King skeptic, wouldn't you say? All right, so that's it today. We're out of time, so let me know what King book or any other book that you would like to see me review on this channel in the future. As always, thank you very much for tuning in. Please subscribe by hitting the subscribe button below there. Remember, you can always get in touch with me via Facebook, Goodreads, and I will see you next time. Happy reading.